Let me ask you something. What if I told you that the most iconic American car ever built, a car so legendary it created an entire automotive category, a car that has been in continuous production for over 60 years, almost never happened? What if the executives sitting in boardrooms at Ford Motor Company nearly killed it before a single tire ever hit the pavement? What if the man who would eventually become its biggest champion was told, flat out, that the idea was ridiculous, that nobody would buy it, and that the whole project was a waste of time and money? And what if, on top of all that, the name they wanted to give it, the name we all know, the name tattooed on the hearts of millions of enthusiasts around the world, couldn't even be used in one of the most important markets in Europe? That's not fiction. That's the real, raw, almost unbelievable story of the Ford Mustang. And today we're going deep. We're pulling back the curtain on the backroom battles, the personality clashes, the near-death moments, and the absolute chaos that surrounded the birth of an American legend. Strap in, because this is the story they don't put on the dealer floor placard. To understand why the Mustang almost never existed, you have to understand what was happening inside Ford Motor Company in the early 1960s. Ford was a company in transition. They were coming out of a decade where the big, chrome-heavy, boat-sized American car was king. Think massive tail fins. Think bench seats wide enough to sleep on. Think engines that drank fuel like they had a personal vendetta against your wallet. But something was shifting in American culture. The baby boomers, the largest generation the country had ever seen, were starting to come of age. They were turning 18, 20, 25. They were getting jobs, getting driver's licenses, and getting very clear about one thing. They did not want their parents' car. They wanted something sporty, something with personality, something that felt like it belonged to them, not to the guy who wore a suit to the office in 1955. Ford's research teams were picking up on this shift. But here's the problem. Building a new car from scratch costs an enormous amount of money. And Ford's upper management was deeply skeptical. Why spend millions developing something new when the existing lineup was already selling? Why take the risk? The answer to that question was a man named Lee Iacocca. Now, if you know anything about automotive history, you know that name. But in the early 1960s, Iacocca was still climbing. He was the Ford division general manager, and he was a man burning with ambition and a very specific vision. He could see what the data was telling him. He could see the youth market coming, and he was willing to fight for it. He championed the project. He pushed it through layers of corporate resistance. And he found the engineer who would make it real. Here's a detail that still blows my mind when I think about it. The development of the original Ford Mustang, from serious concept to production-ready automobile, took just 18 months. 18 months. In today's automotive world, developing a new vehicle platform typically takes 5 to 7 years. And this was the 1960s, with far less sophisticated design and engineering tools. No CAD software. No computer simulations. No digital prototypes. Everything was done by hand, with clay models and drafting tables and sheer human determination. The man overseeing that insane timeline was Donald N. Fry, Iacocca's assistant general manager and chief engineer for what was internally called the T5 project. Fry supervised the overall development of the car and kept the entire process moving at a pace that most engineers would have called impossible. And the way they made it possible was brilliantly practical. Rather than designing everything from scratch, which would have been both expensive and time-consuming, Ford built the Mustang on familiar, proven components already in production for other vehicles. The interior, chassis, suspension, and drivetrain components were largely derived from the Ford Falcon and Fairlane. This wasn't laziness. It was genius. By using components that were already in production, Ford dramatically shortened the learning curve for assembly workers. Dealers didn't need to invest in entirely new spare parts inventory, and the cost to the consumer stayed manageable. The advertised list price when the car launched was just $2,368, which in today's money works out to roughly $24,000 for a stylish, sporty American coupe. Think about that for a second. That price point was intentional. That price point was a weapon. Now, let's talk about something that almost derailed the entire project in a way that had nothing to do with engineering or finance. Let's talk about the name. Because the car we know as the Mustang almost had a very different name. And behind the scenes, there was a genuine battle over what to call it. Here's how the naming story actually went. John Najjar, an executive stylist at Ford who was a fan of the legendary World War II P-51 Mustang fighter plane, is officially credited by Ford with suggesting the Mustang name. Najjar co-designed the first prototype, known as the Ford Mustang I, back in 1961, working alongside fellow Ford stylist Philip T. Clark. The Mustang I made its formal public debut at the United States Grand Prix in Watkins Glen, New York, on October 7, 1962, where Formula One race driver Dan Gurney took the second prototype around the track in a demonstration run. But there's an alternative version of the naming story that's equally fascinating. Robert J. Eggert, Ford Division's market research manager, may have been the first to seriously put the Mustang name on the table. Eggert was a breeder of quarter horses, and in 1960, his wife gave him a book called The Mustangs by J. Frank Dobie as a birthday gift. That book sparked the idea. As the person responsible for researching potential names for Ford's new concept car, Eggert added Mustang to the list for focus group testing. Under the heading Suitability as Name for the Special Car, Mustang won by a wide margin. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone was sold on Mustang. The designers themselves? They preferred Cougar. Early styling bucks, the clay models used to develop the car's appearance, were actually wearing Cougar grille emblems. An entire advertising campaign was prepared using the Torino name. And Henry Ford II himself wanted to call it the T-Bird too, a reference to the beloved Thunderbird. And then there was the Germany problem. The name Mustang could not be used in Germany.
Why?
Because a company called Krupp, yes, the legendary German industrial giant, had manufactured trucks between 1951 and 1960 for using the Mustang name. They owned it. Ford needed to either buy the name or use something different. Ford's response? They refused to pay Krupp approximately $10,000 for the rights to the name. In today's money, that's roughly $103,000. For one of the most important automotive markets in Europe, Ford walked away from a name deal over $103,000. And there was another complication. Kreidler, a manufacturer of mopeds in Germany, also used the Mustang name. So when the car launched, it was sold in Germany as the Ford T5, a holdover from the car's internal project code name. German buyers drove T5s until December 1978. Think about that for a moment. One of the most iconic cars in American history was sold for 14 years in Germany under a completely different name because Ford wouldn't spend $10,000. That decision, whether right or wrong, is pure automotive history. Before we get to the launch, let's go back even further to understand where this car's DNA actually came from. The original 1962 Ford Mustang I was a two-seat, mid-engined roadster. Not a pony car. Not the long hood, short deck proportions we associate with the Mustang name. It was a sleek, low-slung sports car that used the German Ford Taunus V4 engine. It looked like something you'd see at Le Mans. But Ford's research was telling them something important. The American buyer in 1964 wasn't shopping for a European-style two-seat roadster. They wanted 4 seats. They wanted practicality alongside the sportiness. They wanted a car they could take on a date and bring to work on Monday. So the 1962 Mustang I concept evolved into the 1963 Mustang II 4-seater concept, which Ford used to test public interest before committing to full production. The Mustang II concept had a variation of the production model's front and rear ends, with a roofline that Saturday, February 7 inches lower than the production car would ultimately use. Gail Halderman's side view design became the basis for the first clay model of what would become the production Mustang. And the platform decision was made. The car would be based on the second-generation North American Ford Falcon Compact. Everything else would flow from there. The T5 project had its direction. Now it needed its moment. April 17, 1964. The New York World's Fair. This is the moment everyone talks about when they discuss the Mustang launch. But the real story is even more dramatic than the official version. Because the Mustang was actually first sold to the public not at the World's Fair, but 4 days earlier, on April 14, 1964, at a Ford dealership in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. A Canadian buyer technically owned the first production Mustang before the official American launch even happened. The car that became serial number 1, a 1964 1/2 convertible, was sold to a man named Stanley Tucker. And in a story that has become Mustang legend, when Ford produced its 1 millionth Mustang, the company tracked Tucker down and gave him that car in exchange for his historic original. The first and the millionth connected across time. Now back to the launch itself. Ford had placed favorable publicity articles in 2,600 newspapers to coincide with the official reveal. The response was overwhelming. People lined up at dealerships. People who had never shown serious interest in a car before were suddenly captivated by this $2,368 sporty coupe with a long hood and short deck. The original sales forecasts? Less than 100,000 units in the first year. That mark was surpassed in 3 months. Read that again. Ford's entire first-year sales target, blown past in 90 days. By the end of the model year, another 318,000 units had been sold, a record at the time. In its first 18 months, more than 1 million Mustangs had been built. The 1 millionth Mustang was sold within 2 years of the car's launch. And Ford had accomplished something that hadn't been done since 1927, when the Model A had launched. This was the most successful vehicle launch in nearly 4 decades. The 1965 Mustang also won the Tiffany Gold Medal for Excellence in American Design, the first automobile ever to receive that honor. And the Mustang's first public appearance on a racetrack? Pace car for the 1964 Indianapolis 500. The same year, Mustangs won first and second in class at the Tour de France International Rally. The car was barely born, and it was already winning. Now here's something that drives Mustang purists absolutely wild, and it's been debated at car shows and in enthusiast forums for 60 years. Ford began producing the Mustang on March 9, 1964, 5 months before the normal start of the 1965 model year. The early production cars are often called 1964 1/2 models. But here's the thing, Ford never officially called them that. Every single Mustang was advertised, then coded, and titled by Ford as a 1965 model. So, why the distinction? Because when August 1964 arrived, the traditional start of the new model year, Ford made several important changes to the car. Backup lights were added to some models. Generators were replaced by alternators. The 6-cylinder engine was upgraded from 170 to 200 cubic inches, gaining 19 horsepower. The V8 grew from 260 to 289 cubic inches with a power increase from 164 to 210 horsepower. And then there were the quirks that came with the rush to production. The horn ring on early Mustangs bore the Ford Falcon logo, covered by a trim ring stamped with the Ford Mustang logo. The Falcon underneath, the Mustang on top, a perfect metaphor for what the car actually was under the skin. These characteristics were significant enough that 121,538 early production cars have been tracked separately by enthusiasts ever since, and the 1964 1/2 designation has endured with purists despite Ford never officially using it. This is the kind of detail that separates someone who likes Mustangs from someone who loves them. The success of the Mustang did something that nobody at Ford had fully anticipated. It didn't just sell cars. It created an entirely new automotive category. The term pony car, derived directly from the Mustang nameplate, entered the automotive vocabulary and defined a segment that didn't exist before April 17, 1964. Long hood, short deck, affordable, sporty, for seats, rear-wheel drive, fun. And once the other American manufacturers saw the numbers Ford was putting up, they came running. General Motors launched the Chevrolet Camaro and Pontiac Firebird in 1967. AMC brought the Javelin in 1968. Dodge unleashed the Challenger in 1970. The Plymouth Barracuda had actually launched 16 days before the Mustang, on April 1, 1964, but it never captured the same cultural momentum. The Mustang's influence wasn't limited to American shores either. The Toyota Celica was brought to the United States market, and the Ford Capri, built in Germany and Britain and sold in America by Lincoln Mercury as a captive import, was also marketed here. Ford even launched its own companion car, the Mercury Cougar, in 1967 as a unique-bodied, higher-trim alternative to the Mustang. One car, one launch, an entire global segment created. This is the part of the story that Mustang loyalists tell with a kind of pained expression. Because after the extraordinary success of the first generation, something started to go wrong. Under the watch of S. Bunky Knudsen, the Mustang began evolving in a direction that many, including Iacocca himself, would come to deeply regret. The car that had been celebrated for its youth and agility began growing, and growing, and growing. From 1967 until 1973, the Mustang got bigger but not necessarily more powerful. Consumer demand had shifted toward luxury-type designs, heavier, softer, more insulated from the road. Ford chased that market, and the Mustang paid the price. By 1971, the car was nearly 3 inches wider than the 1970 model. Its front and rear track had also widened by 3 inches. The sports roof models had a nearly flat rear roofline that critics described as having poor visibility for the driver and a cramped interior that felt nothing like the original car's airy, sporting character. One historian writing about this period captured it perfectly. The Mustang grew fat and lazy, and Ford was out of the go-fast business almost entirely by 1971. The restyling in those years sought to create the illusion that the cars were even larger, which is almost philosophically opposite to everything the original Mustang stood for. The cars gained roughly 800 pounds over the course of the first generation. Sales fell. Consumers who might have bought Mustangs were instead choosing the smaller Ford Pinto and Maverick. Iacocca himself, the man who had championed the original, later delivered what might be the most damning automotive autopsy quote in history: "The Mustang market never left us. We left it." Let that land for a moment. The man who birthed the Mustang looked at what his own company had done to it and admitted, simply and brutally, that Ford had abandoned the thing that made the car great. By 1970, Lee Iacocca had been named president of Ford Motor Company, and he had seen enough. He ordered a smaller, more fuel-efficient Mustang for 1974. The initial plan was to base the new car on the Ford Maverick. But ultimately, the decision was made to use the Ford Pinto subcompact as the foundation. This was a controversial choice that Mustang purists have argued about ever since. The new model, called the Mustang II, was introduced on September 21, 1973. The timing could not have been more fortuitous. 2 months later, the first 1973 oil crisis hit. Americans were suddenly desperate for fuel-efficient, smaller cars. Ford had, almost accidentally, positioned the Mustang too perfectly for the moment. Iacocca wanted the car finished to a high standard. He famously called it a little jewel. And in fairness, the Mustang II did return the car to something closer to its 1965 predecessor in size, shape, and overall styling. Its reduced dimensions allowed it to compete against successful imported sports coupes like the Japanese Datsun 240Z, Toyota Celica, and the European Ford Capri. First-year sales of the Mustang II were 385,993 cars. Compare that to the original Mustang's 12-month sales record of 418,812, and you see that the car was, by any commercial standard, a genuine success. It was not the barnstorming triumph of 1964, but in the middle of an oil crisis, selling nearly 386,000 units was remarkable. But here's the problem that enthusiasts could never fully forgive. The Mustang II was not only smaller than the first generation, it was also heavier. New U.S. emission and safety regulations demanded additional equipment that added weight. Performance was reduced. The galloping Mustang emblem, as one writer put it, became a less muscular steed that seemed to be cantering. The Mustang II was ultimately an early example of the malaise-era downsizing that hit Detroit's Big Three hard throughout the mid-1970s. It kept the Mustang name alive. It kept Ford profitable during an impossible period, but it did so at a cost to the car's soul that took years to recover from. The third-generation Mustang arrived on the Fox platform in 1979, and slowly, painstakingly slowly, the soul of the car began to return. The Fox body Mustang became a canvas for performance once again, and by 1982, the Mustang GT was back, using a specially modified high-output 302 cubic inch engine that reminded buyers what the car could actually feel like when Ford remembered what it was supposed to be. But here's another chapter in the near-cancellation story that most people don't know about. In the early 1980s, facing poor sales and escalating fuel prices, Ford began developing a new Mustang. And what they were developing was not a Mustang in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a front-wheel drive, Japanese-designed vehicle, a variant of the Mazda MX-6 that would have been assembled at the Auto Alliance International plant in Flat Rock, Michigan. Front-wheel drive, Japanese-designed. No V8 option. When enthusiasts got wind of this, they were furious. Letters flooded into Ford. People who loved the Mustang, who had grown up with it, who had made it part of their identity, objected loudly and clearly to what they saw as a fundamental betrayal of everything the car represented. Ford listened. The existing Mustang continued in production, and the Mazda MX-6 variant had a last-minute name change from Mustang to Probe and was released as a 1989 model. The Mustang was saved. Again. This time by its own fans. In August 2018, Ford produced the 10 millionth Mustang. 10 million cars. And here's the detail that gives that number its full emotional weight. The 10 millionth Mustang was matching the first 1965 Mustang, a Wimbledon white convertible with a V8 engine. White. Convertible. V8. 60 years of history, compressed into a deliberate callback to where it all started. In a world where automakers are killing off performance cars, eliminating convertibles, and electrifying everything, Ford chose to mark this milestone by acknowledging what the Mustang actually is. Not what market forces want it to be, but what it has always been at its core. And the sales data tells a story that is simultaneously inspiring and sobering. The 1966 model year remains the peak. 607,568 units sold in the United States. For context, 2024 sales came in at 44,003. The market has changed. The competition is different. The world is different. But the Mustang is still here. Still rear-wheel drive. Still available with a V8. Still being built at the Flat Rock assembly plant in Michigan. And with the 7th generation now in production, featuring up to 500 horsepower in the Dark Horse variant and a track-focused Dark Horse SC supercharged version unveiled in January 2026, the car continues to evolve while holding on to the things that made people fall in love with it in the first place. The Ford Mustang could have been stopped before it started, killed by corporate skepticism and boardroom caution. It could have been named the Cougar, or the Torino, or the T-Bird 2. It could have died in the bloated, 800-pound excess of the early 1970s. It could have been replaced by a front-wheel drive Japanese platform in the 1980s. It should have been called the T5 permanently, at least in Germany. Instead, it survived every single one of those near-death moments. It survived because of the vision of one man pushing it through corporate resistance. It survived because the public wanted it badly enough to make the numbers impossible to argue with. It survived because fans cared enough to write letters when its identity was threatened. And it survived because, at some fundamental level, the idea of an affordable, rear-wheel drive, V8, powered American sports car built for the open road is not just a product. It's an idea. And ideas that true are very hard to kill. The Mustang turns 61 this year. And it's still running. If you made it to the end of this video, you clearly love this car as much as I do. Drop a comment telling me which generation of Mustang is closest to your heart, because I guarantee this community has opinions. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because we're just getting started on stories like this one. Take care of your cars. And keep driving something with a soul.